A man sits in the darkness, pen scratching across paper, while an entire continent bleeds outside his window. Somewhere far away, generals move armies and dictators redraw maps. Yet tonight, the fate of thousands may depend on the lies of one soft-spoken Spaniard who has never fired the shot that could change history, but may still decide where that history breaks. Welcome back, listeners. Today, we delve into the shadows to uncover the story of Juan Pujol Garbo, the quiet, improbable architect of one of the greatest deceptions in the history of war. This is the story of a man who built an army out of ghosts, who fooled the Third Reich with nothing but nerve, patience, and an imagination so precise that even seasoned officers mistook fiction for truth. To understand Juan Pujol, you have to begin not with triumph, but with suffocation. Europe in the late 1930s was a continent losing its breath. The air itself seemed heavy with slogans, uniforms, accusations, and marching boots. Every border felt temporary. Every government seemed to speak in the language of necessity, sacrifice, destiny. The old world, with its cafes, its hesitant diplomacy, its private lives, was being swallowed by movements that demanded total allegiance. Men were no longer expected merely to live, they were expected to belong. Spain had already endured the rehearsal for the nightmare. The Spanish Civil War had torn that country into bitterness and rubble. Brothers were separated by ideology, neighbors by suspicion, streets by barricades, homes by fear. It was the kind of war that reached into kitchens and bedrooms, the kind that made neutral words dangerous and private thoughts potentially fatal. And for a young man like Juan Pujol, that was more than politics. It was revelation. He saw what fanaticism looked like up close. He saw how quickly certainty curdled into cruelty. He saw that when men begin worshiping systems, they usually stop seeing other human beings at all. He emerged from that atmosphere not as a natural soldier, not as a zealot, and not as a revolutionary, but as something far more unusual for that age. He emerged disillusioned. He had tasted the machinery of extremism from more than one side and found it equally poisonous. He did not come out of it dreaming of banners. He came out of it longing for decency. That, listeners, is one of the strangest and most important truths at the heart of this story. Juan Pujol was not born in the shadows. He was not a hardened operative raised in secret schools. He was not an aristocratic adventurer, nor a university mastermind, nor a career intelligence officer. He had no polished pedigree for espionage, no uniformed prestige, no glittering resume of covert service. He was, at first glance, the sort of man history usually passes by without a second look. And perhaps that is why he became so dangerous. Because the century was filled with men who believed power came from force. From tanks, divisions, air fleets, prisons, torture chambers, parades. Juan Pujol would prove that power could also come from an entirely different source. From being underestimated, from seeming small, from allowing monstrous men to mistake humility for weakness and imagination for innocence. When the Second World War began in 1939, much of Europe looked toward Germany with a mix of dread and fatalism. France would fall. Much of the continent would kneel or be crushed. Britain, isolated and battered, would stand in defiance, but often in loneliness. In neutral countries, embassies became listening posts. Ports became rumor mills. Hotels became theaters of surveillance. Every traveler was potentially a courier. Every businessman might be a recruiter. Every quiet stranger in the corner of a cafe might be carrying a codebook in his coat lining. And in Spain, officially neutral but thick with Axis influence, these pressures were everywhere. German operatives moved with confidence. Sympathizers watched and whispered. Anti-British feeling flared. It was a landscape in which a determined man could disappear into intrigue if he knew how to present himself. Juan Pujol made a decision that, at first, must have seemed absurd even to him. If Britain would not let him help, then he would force Britain to notice him. He would become useful by first becoming dangerous. Think about the nerve required for that. He was not invited. He was not trained. He was rejected. More than once. The British, cautious and overburdened, saw no reason to trust a Spaniard with grand intentions and no credentials. To them, he was just another volunteer, another uncertain figure from a neutral state, another possible liability in a war already drowning in uncertainty. Many men would have stopped there. Many would have told themselves that they had tried, that history had closed the door, that they were powerless. But Pujol was one of those rare people whose determination becomes sharper after humiliation. Rebuffed by the British, he did not abandon the idea. He reversed it. If the British refused to recruit him as a spy against Germany, then he would recruit himself into Germany's service and then return, transformed, undeniable, carrying proof in his hands. It sounds reckless because it was reckless, catastrophically so. One false step and he could have vanished into a prison cell or a ditch or an unmarked grave. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was not a debating society. It was a machine of war, and even when it looked foolish in hindsight, it was still capable of deadly efficiency. If they had seen through him too early, he would not have received a second chance. So he built a version of himself. This is where the story begins to acquire that almost theatrical quality that later earned him the name Garbo. Juan Pujol understood something essential about espionage. A cover is not merely a false name, it is a moral costume. It requires not only papers, not only mannerisms, but an emotional logic that others can believe. The lie must feel as though it has roots. He presented himself to the Germans as a fervent supporter of their cause, a man aligned with fascist values, a man who could travel, observe, and be of use. To such men, conviction mattered. He gave them conviction. To such men, anti-British sentiment mattered. He gave them that as well. He offered them the portrait they wanted to see, because vanity is often the easiest lock to pick. Totalitarian systems do not simply want obedience. They want affirmation. They want to believe that history is drawing all serious people toward them. Pujol fed that hunger. And the Germans, to their lasting humiliation, accepted him. He was instructed to spy in Britain. That was the assignment. But Juan Pujol did not go to Britain. He went to Lisbon. Now pause there for a moment, because Lisbon in wartime was a city built for ghosts. Neutral Portugal became a waiting room for Europe's secrets. Refugees, diplomats, smugglers, couriers, police informants, black market brokers, lovers on borrowed time, exiles with forged passports, intelligence officers pretending to be commercial attachés pretending not to be intelligence officers. There was cigarette smoke in hotel bars and coded phrases in lobbies. There were glances held 1 second too long. There were names that changed with the day. If Casablanca belonged to cinema, Lisbon belonged to real life. It was glamour with terror just beneath the skin. And in that city, Juan Pujol performed one of the most daring acts of bluff in intelligence history. From Lisbon, without setting foot in Britain, he began sending reports to the Germans as though he were already operating inside the United Kingdom. He educated himself with whatever he could find: travel guides, reference books, public materials, snippets of information, timetables, advertisements, the ordinary debris of civilian life, transformed through discipline into plausible intelligence. He turned scraps into atmosphere. He turned atmosphere into reports. He turned reports into trust. This is the part of the story that fascinates me most, listeners, because it reveals the real engine of espionage. Not gadgets, not dramatic chases, not poison rings and hidden pistols. The engine is credibility, and credibility is built from detail. A liar who invents grand things too quickly will usually fail. A great deceiver knows that truth must be embedded like bone inside the flesh of fiction. Pujol understood that instinctively. His reports were not merely bold, they were textured, mundane in the right places, specific in ways that suggested lived experience. He did not try to sound like a novelist. He tried to sound like a man doing tedious work carefully. That is how the trap closed. Soon, the Germans believed they possessed a valuable source. Not a flamboyant one, not a heroic one, a useful one. The kind of source intelligence services treasure because he seems steady, unremarkable, dependable. The very banality of his reports became their strength. And when errors appeared, as errors must in any human enterprise, he learned another crucial lesson. He did not deny them clumsily. He explained them through the existence of intermediaries. That was the seed of his masterpiece, the imaginary agents. At first, this was practical. If a report was late or inaccurate, he could blame another source. If a detail needed emotional color, he could invent the personality of whoever supposedly observed it. If a region required access he could not plausibly claim, then someone else in his network could have it. One invention made the next easier. Soon, Juan Pujol was no longer a single agent. He was the head of a network that did not exist. Listeners, think of the pressure of that. Each invented man or woman needed a background, habits, access, reasons for loyalty, patterns of movement, strengths, weaknesses, sometimes illnesses, sometimes debts, sometimes tempers. A single false life can be difficult enough to sustain. Pujol began sustaining dozens. He had to remember not only what he had told the Germans, but what each imaginary subordinate might believably know, when each one could travel, which one might misunderstand a military designation, which one drank too much, which one was diligent, which one could be trusted near ports, which one knew rail traffic, which one had relatives, which one needed expenses. He was creating human beings out of administrative necessity. But over time, those phantoms acquired an eerie reality. The Germans paid them, argued over them, relied on them. One could almost imagine them gathering in some impossible room, 27 invisible operatives waiting for instructions from the only man who knew they were made of paper and nerve. That is what made Juan Pujol so extraordinary. He was not merely deceiving individuals, he was managing the bureaucracy of an entire hallucination. Of course, hallucinations are dangerous even for the man creating them. Every expanding fiction becomes a prison of memory. Miss one detail and the whole edifice can tremble. Contradict a past report and suspicion may begin. Forget the emotional tone of an invented subordinate, and years of patient credibility might crack in a single sentence. Espionage is often described as a game of chess, but that is too neat. Chessboards stay still. Pujol's board was alive. Every piece talked back. Every invented move had to remain compatible with dozens of earlier moves. It was not chess. It was juggling knives in a dark room. And still, he continued. Eventually, British intelligence noticed that someone was feeding the Germans a strange mixture of information from Iberia. More importantly, they noticed that the Germans were taking this source seriously. The thing Pujol had hoped for from the beginning was finally happening. He had made himself impossible to ignore. By then, he had achieved the nearly unimaginable. He had built a reputation with the enemy so convincing that Britain, which had refused to trust him as a volunteer, now had to confront the fact that the Germans already trusted him as an asset. Only then did the British bring him in. There is a quiet irony in that moment that deserves to be savored. The amateur had forced the professionals to accept him by outperforming their caution. He had walked into the war through a door he built himself. Once under British control, however, the stakes changed. Improvisation would no longer be enough. His operation had to be formalized, disciplined, integrated into the machinery of Allied deception. He was given handlers. His communications were managed. His traffic would become part of something larger than personal audacity. And one of the most important figures in this next chapter was his case officer, Thomas Harris. Harris is one of those men history often leaves in the margins, though the margins are where so much intelligence work actually lives. Fluent, perceptive, patient, and able to navigate Pujol's mind and methods, Harris became translator, collaborator, guardian, and co-architect. The relationship between agent and handler is always delicate. It is half strategy, half psychology. A good handler must know when to restrain, when to encourage, when to polish, when to doubt, when to listen to instinct. With Pujol, such balance was essential. He was brilliantly imaginative, but imagination in espionage must be harnessed, not merely admired. And then came the name, Garbo. A name borrowed from the great actress Greta Garbo, because Pujol was, in the eyes of his British masters, the finest performer in the world. It was both compliment and warning. Acting at this level is not ornament, it is survival. One weak performance and the audience does not merely leave disappointed, the audience sends police. Under British guidance, Garbo's ghost network expanded with astonishing sophistication. Each imaginary sub-agent developed a role in the wider deception. Military observers, port contacts, ideological sympathizers, travelers, civilian watchers, men with access to snippets of strategic movement, men too minor to attract attention and therefore perfect for the collection of fragments. The Germans, believing they had a broad and dependable intelligence architecture inside Britain, invested faith and resources in it. They did not want merely Garbo. They wanted the invisible web around him. And what a marvelous, terrible web it became. Yet there was another layer to all this, one less often discussed and far more human. Pujol was not operating alone in the emotional sense. His family lived within the pressure field of his choices. His wife, like so many spouses in the history of espionage, had to endure confusion, instability, secrecy, dislocation. We often romanticize the lone spy, but the reality is that covert lives radiate damage outward. Every lie told to an enemy usually requires lies at home as well. Every secret mission distorts ordinary domestic trust. And because the spy can never fully explain, the family is often left to suffer consequences without the dignity of understanding them. Imagine, listeners, what it must have felt like to live beside a man whose life was divided into layers you could not safely touch. A man outwardly calm, perhaps even tender at times, yet inwardly carrying an ever-growing burden of memorized fictions, enemy expectations, British oversight, and mortal risk. Espionage is not only dangerous because an enemy may shoot you, it is dangerous because it hollows the boundaries of the self. It asks a person to live in fragments for so long that returning to wholeness becomes difficult. Pujol, I think, felt that weight deeply. He was not a cold machine. That is part of what made him compelling. He had the nerves for deception, yes, but also the conscience to feel its cost. He hated what Nazism represented. He believed his work served humanity. But noble purpose does not cancel fear. It only makes fear more intimate. Because once you believe your lies are saving lives, every mistake becomes unbearable. Every missed detail becomes a possible grave. And by 1943 into 1944, the war was moving toward the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Somewhere in the hidden planning rooms of the Allies, an immense question loomed over everything. When the liberation of Western Europe begins, where will the Germans believe the blow is falling? This is where Garbo's private theater became a weapon of continental consequence. The Allied High Command knew that the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe could not rely only on ships and courage. Surprise mattered. Misperception mattered. If the Germans concentrated their strongest reserves at the true landing site, the beaches could become slaughterhouses beyond description. Thousands were going to die no matter what. The question was whether deception could prevent tens of thousands more from joining them. The Germans expected invasion. They did not know the precise place. Normandy would be the real target. But Pas-de-Calais, closer to Britain and geographically plausible, was the place the Allies wanted them to fear most. To persuade an enemy that the real dagger is only a feint while the false dagger is the true thrust, you need more than forged documents and inflatable tanks. You need a source the enemy already trusts to tell him what he is most prepared to believe. Garbo was that source. By now, his network had matured into a convincing machine. To the Germans, these agents were not abstractions. They were investments. They were a precious system embedded within enemy territory. And so, when traffic from Garbo described military preparations, troop concentrations, organizational hints, and the suggestive shape of future operations, German analysts listened with a seriousness that had taken years to build. That seriousness was the product of thousands of small decisions. That is the lesson I want you to hear. History often remembers the grand climax, the landings, the speeches, the maps. But the climax only works because of the long apprenticeship of credibility. Every earlier letter, every carefully phrased report, every invented expense, every plausible delay, every subordinate with a believable weakness, every little stitch in the fabric of deception. All of it was preparing the enemy mind for the moment it mattered most. The beauty, if such a word can be used in wartime, was that Garbo's success depended on seeming imperfect. An informer who is too flawless becomes suspicious. One who occasionally sends information too late. One who explains gaps through the friction of real life. One who sounds burdened by the inefficiencies of his own network. Such a source feels authentic. So the British and Pujol together cultivated not only authority, but texture. Not just accuracy in select matters, but the impression of a living operation with all the untidy edges that real operations possess. This was psychological warfare at its finest. The object was not merely to feed falsehoods. The object was to shape the enemy's confidence in its own reasoning, to make German intelligence officers feel clever for concluding exactly what the Allies wanted them to conclude, to tempt them into partnership with the lie. Meanwhile, beyond the abstractions of intelligence traffic, the war ground on with merciless appetite. Bombed cities smoldered. Occupied families whispered behind drawn curtains. Young men trained on English soil for missions many would not survive. Somewhere, a French child slept under rationing. Somewhere, a German mother folded a field gray uniform. Somewhere, a Jewish family disappeared into the machinery of annihilation. All of this suffering formed the true moral backdrop of Garbo's work. His reports were not bloodless paperwork. They were attempts, however indirect, to shorten the life of a monstrous regime. Still, I cannot pretend there was not something eerie in the process. Night after night, he fed a system built on murder. He had to sound useful to men serving Hitler. He had to receive their confidence, their payments, their praise. He had to cultivate trust with those he despised. That is one of the silent torments of double life. You must become intimate with the mind of your enemy, not just to understand it, but to flatter it. You must feed its assumptions. You must sometimes sound like it. What happens to a person when he performs that role for too long? When each successful message proves that he can think like the very men he hopes to defeat? When the evil he opposes begins to rely on the voice he has lent it? The archives may preserve the messages. They do not preserve the silence afterward, the private exhaustion, the moments when a man sits alone and wonders what his own voice sounds like now. And as 1944 advanced, that silence must have grown unbearable, because the final act was approaching. By then, Garbo's transmissions were flowing into a strategic landscape charged with imminent invasion. The enemy was watchful. The Allies were secretive to the point of obsession. Every report mattered. The need for precision became agonizing. Send too little, and the Germans may look elsewhere for certainty. Send too much, too accurately, and you may endanger the operation you are meant to protect. Warn them too soon, and men die on the beaches in even greater numbers. Warn them too late, and the source may look useless or compromised. It was a narrow bridge over an abyss. And here lies one of the most chilling paradoxes in intelligence history. For Garbo to remain believable at the decisive hour, he could not simply be silent about the invasion. A trusted source who knows nothing when history erupts becomes suspicious. But a trusted source who reveals too much too soon becomes a traitor to his true side. So the deception required exquisite timing. Enough truth to preserve the lie. Enough lie to conceal the truth. You can almost hear the clock ticking in those rooms. Imagine the tension in Britain as the invasion date approached. Maps pinned to walls. Cigarette smoke trapped under low ceilings. Operators hunched over sets. Officers rereading drafts. Messages checked and rechecked. The sea itself waiting beyond blackout curtains. Ships assembling. Men boarding. Priests whispering prayers. Engineers studying tides. Pilots learning routes in case they did not return. And within this gigantic, thunderous machinery of liberation, one quiet Spaniard sat amid papers and codes, preparing sentences designed to mislead an empire. The contrast is haunting. One man writing, thousands of ships moving. One fabricated network of invisible agents, hundreds of thousands of real soldiers preparing to cross the channel into gunfire. That is why Garbo's work mattered. Not because deception is romantic, not because spies are glamorous, but because sometimes the deadliest part of war is where an army is waiting when the first boats arrive. The Germans, of course, were not fools in the simple sense. They were experienced, hardened, analytical, and often suspicious. They knew invasion was coming. They weighed evidence constantly. They studied feints. They expected trickery. That is what made the operation so astonishing. Garbo did not defeat naivety. He defeated vigilance. He defeated the enemy's ability to distinguish plausible expectation from manufactured certainty. And still, danger pressed closer. By this point, any small inconsistency might have drawn scrutiny from multiple directions. German intelligence might cross-check one source against another. Radio traffic could be monitored. Intercepts could shift. Rival agencies might compete. One anxious analyst could ask one dangerous question. One delay in communication could become the crack through which disaster entered. And, on the British side, nerves were no less taut. The higher the stakes, the less room there was for personality, improvisation, or error. A source as valuable as Garbo was also a source who could, if mishandled, become catastrophically dangerous. Little did they know, the greatest test of his career was now almost upon him. For years he had built his reputation patiently, lie by lie, brick by brick, phantom by phantom. He had convinced the Germans that he possessed eyes and ears across Britain. He had taught them to trust not just him, but the architecture of illusion around him. He had done what many would consider impossible. But the cruel law of espionage is that past brilliance guarantees nothing. In the end, everything is judged by the decisive moment. And that moment was coming in the darkness of June. Soon, the sea would fill with ships. Soon, paratroopers would vanish into the night. Soon, coastal guns would open. Soon, Europe would tremble under the first shock of liberation. And when that happened, Garbo would have to perform the most delicate act of his entire double life. He would have to tell the truth just enough, to preserve a lie large enough to reshape the battlefield. If he failed, suspicion could bloom instantly. The Germans might realize that the network they treasured was a mirage. Their reserves might be redirected with deadly speed. The deception operation could begin to unravel at exactly the hour when Allied soldiers were most vulnerable, packed into landing craft with spray in their faces and fear in their throats. So there he sat, the mild man from Barcelona, the amateur who became a phantom master, the spy who had invented an army of non-existent souls. Outside, war drew in its breath. Inside, on paper and over the air, he prepared to gamble everything on timing. And somewhere in the machinery of the Reich, men were waiting for his next message. They still believed he was theirs. The night finally broke with engines, salt, and prayer. Across the channel, beneath a sky crowded with aircraft and fate, men moved toward the coast of France, knowing that dawn would reveal either the first great breach in Hitler's fortress or one more catastrophe written in blood. And in that same hour, while the sea carried armies, Juan Pujol Garbo sat inside the quieter battlefield, where a sentence delivered too soon or too late could still decide who lived long enough to see the sunrise. By June of 1944, the war had entered that merciless phase in which everything felt both enormous and fragile. The Allied command had assembled a force of staggering scale, ships by the thousands, aircraft in swarms, soldiers from different nations bound together by necessity and dread. Yet all that steel and discipline, all that preparation, all that courage, still depended on one delicate human factor: whether the Germans would understand what was happening quickly enough to crush it. That is what makes the final phase of Garbo's story so haunting. The world remembers the beaches, the surf, the bunkers, the dead in the shallows. It remembers the visible drama of war. But before many of those young men ever stepped into the water, a quieter drama had already begun to shape their chances. One deception had to hold. One false belief had to survive the arrival of truth. And truth, listeners, was now arriving with gunfire. The Allied landings began in Normandy on June 6, 1944. The operation was no rumor anymore. It was not a theoretical future. It was thunder, flame, and bodies. The long-feared invasion had finally begun. For German commanders, the old question had become immediate. Was this the main blow, or the opening move of something larger? That was the hinge. Not whether invasion was taking place. That much was obvious. The hinge was where the Germans would commit themselves in the hours and days that followed. If they became convinced that Normandy was only the beginning, a diversion to distract from an even larger assault at Pas-de-Calais, then they might hold back crucial forces. They might hesitate. They might wait for the phantom second strike that Garbo and the wider Allied deception had spent so long planting in their minds. But to keep that deception alive in the face of actual landings required a performance so precise that it almost strains belief even now. Garbo had to remain what he had always pretended to be, a loyal German agent, a man desperate to provide valuable warning, a man whose network had struggled heroically to bring intelligence through all the friction of wartime chaos. He could not suddenly become silent. He could not become magically omniscient. And he could not allow the Germans to conclude that Normandy itself was the whole truth. The message he sent around the time of the invasion has become one of the most discussed moments in intelligence history. It was constructed with exquisite cruelty. Garbo complained, in effect, that he had indeed attempted to warn them, but that delays and communication problems had prevented his warning from being used in time. This mattered enormously. To the Germans, it preserved the image of a faithful and frustrated servant, not a traitor, not a failure of trust, a dedicated source thwarted by circumstance. There is something almost unbearable in that detail. While Allied troops were fighting and dying in Normandy, Garbo was still protecting his long-built credibility in the eyes of the enemy. He had to seem wounded by their inability to heed him. He had to perform injured loyalty. It was theater at the edge of history. And then came the more important move. He reinforced the idea that Normandy was not the decisive blow, that the real main invasion, the one Germany should fear most, was still expected elsewhere. Pas-de-Calais remained the specter. The Germans, conditioned by months and years of suggestive evidence, were primed to believe it. Garbo did not create that belief in a single message. He activated what had already been planted deep in the enemy's expectation. This is one of the great lessons of deception. The successful lie rarely begins on the day it matters. It begins long before, when the victim is still relaxed enough to absorb it naturally. By June 1944, Garbo's reports had become part of the mental furniture of German analysis. His network was trusted. His assessments fit a larger pattern. He was not asking them to believe something alien. He was inviting them to remain faithful to what they already thought they knew. And so the trap held. German commanders, including Hitler himself, remained deeply concerned that Normandy might be a feint or secondary operation. Reserves that could have been thrown into the battle more decisively were held back in expectation of a larger strike. The 15th Army, positioned in the Pas-de-Calais region, remained where it was for a crucial period. This was not because of Garbo alone. Great operations are never the work of a single hand. But he was one of the most important human channels through which the false picture retained its authority. He was not a side note. He was one of the nerves of the deception itself. Imagine those days from his perspective. Outside his rooms, Britain must have seemed electric with tension. News, secrecy, guarded expressions, urgent movement, and the awareness that history had reached a breaking point. He knew what was happening more clearly than most. He knew not only that the invasion had begun, but that his own messages were part of the invisible struggle determining what the enemy did next. It is one thing to lie in wartime. It is another to lie while knowing that armored divisions may move, or fail to move, because of how well you phrase a report. How does a man sleep under that weight? How does he eat? How does he look at an ordinary lamp, an ordinary window, a cup of tea cooling on a table, and reconcile those small domestic details with the fact that thousands are dying while he waits for the enemy to misunderstand reality exactly as intended? This is where the glamorous myth of espionage should fall away completely. There is no glamour in that kind of pressure, only strain, only the slow poison of responsibility, only the knowledge that the work is necessary and still morally exhausting. If Garbo felt pride, it must have been tangled with dread. If he felt confidence, it could only have been provisional. The enemy had not yet admitted defeat in the deception. They were still listening, still interpreting, still capable of seeing through the fog at the worst possible moment. And for a little while longer, the entire scheme had to go on. Garbo continued to send information that sustained the false belief in a coming main assault at Pas de Calais. The deception had to outlive D-Day itself. That is crucial to understand. The operation was not simply about fooling Germany before the landings. It was about fooling Germany after the landings as well, persuading them that the battle unfolding in Normandy was still not the central event. That required endurance. It required German intelligence to remain trapped inside its own expectation, even while evidence mounted around it. This is where the story becomes almost surreal. Real armies were fighting in France. Real men were dying in hedgerows, fields, villages, and on roads choked with dust and wreckage. And still, in the minds of many German planners, another army remained poised across the Channel. A larger blow, a more decisive one, a phantom army supported by phantom preparations and validated by a phantom network of sources. Ghosts were pinning down divisions. If you want to understand the scale of Garbo's achievement, hold that image in your mind. Not the solitary spy in a trench coat, not the dramatic exchange of microfilm. Picture instead entire formations of enemy troops remaining in place because fiction had been made more convincing than their own fear. That is what deception at the strategic level looks like. It is not theatrical for its own sake. It is theater turned into delay. Delay turned into hesitation. Hesitation turned into opportunity for men fighting with real ammunition on real soil. And the Germans rewarded him for it. There is a bitter irony that sits at the center of this episode like a shard of glass. Garbo, the man who had spent years misleading Nazi Germany on behalf of the Allies, was decorated by the Germans themselves. He received the Iron Cross, a mark of esteem from the very regime he was helping to deceive into disaster. One can hardly imagine a more perfect emblem of double life. The enemy not only trusted him, the enemy honored him. Think of the silence after such news arrived. Think of Garbo holding that knowledge in his hands. Decorated by the Reich, valued by men whose defeat he was laboring to accelerate, praised by a system built on terror, conquest, and extermination. The absurdity of espionage often masks its ugliness, but not here. Here, the ugliness is part of the absurdity. His success required him to become, in German eyes, a model servant of the very cause he despised. And yet the Allies knew what he had done. The British knew. His handlers knew. The hidden world of intelligence, so stingy with praise, recognized that Garbo had helped deliver one of the most consequential deceits in military history. He had not fought on the beaches. He had not commanded a fleet. He had not signed the invasion order. But he had helped hold open the breathing space in which the invasion could survive. The war, of course, did not end in a single week. Normandy was only the breach. Ahead lay months of hard fighting, ruined towns, desperate German resistance, and the slow tightening of the net around the collapsing Reich. But after the landings, the broad direction of history had begun to turn irreversibly. The Western Allies had returned to the continent. Hitler's empire was no longer merely being bombed from afar or fought at its edges. It was being entered, dismantled, forced backward. The beginning of the end had taken visible form. For Garbo, however, visible form was never really the point. Men like him live inside the unwitnessed side of events. Their greatest successes must often remain partially hidden because to reveal too much is to expose methods, networks, and weaknesses. Even after victory, intelligence work resists simple celebration. It is too entangled with secrecy, too morally ambiguous in its methods even when its purpose is just, too dependent on silence. But silence, listeners, can be heavy after war. What happens when a man who has spent years inventing lives, imitating loyalties, and managing perilous illusions is suddenly asked to return to ordinary existence? How does one come back from living in a place where every message can kill, every detail matters, and trust itself is a manufactured substance? The truth is that many spies do not come back cleanly at all. Some are consumed by obscurity. Some become addicted to secrecy. Some find that peacetime feels unreal, almost insulting in its softness. Others discover that their families, who endured years of strain and distance, cannot simply resume a life suspended in midair. The collateral damage in stories like this is often quiet, and that makes it easier to ignore. But I do not want to ignore it. Juan Pujol's wife and family had lived under the long shadow of his secret world. The strains were real. Secrecy, relocations, emotional distance, and the sheer instability of covert life do not vanish when a medal is awarded or a mission is judged successful. There had been tensions before, moments of distress and fracture, moments when the burden of the role spilled into domestic life. This should not surprise us. Espionage turns intimacy into a casualty. The spy may love his family sincerely, but sincerity is no protection against compartmentalization. Once a person is trained by survival to divide himself, home no longer remains untouched by that division. And beyond the family, there is another form of collateral damage, one harder to measure: the damage inside the self. Garbo had built a kingdom of imaginary sub-agents. He had sustained conversations with an enemy through masks layered upon masks. He had managed the life and death credibility of people who did not exist. Such work demands creativity, but also emotional dislocation. To keep those ghosts alive for so long, he had to give them texture. He had to think as them, speak as them, defend them, sometimes even sacrifice them. Yes, sacrifice them. One of the strangest elements of his operation is that some of his fictional agents had to be written out, transferred, discredited, or even invented as dead to preserve the plausibility of the network. Imagine the mental habit formed by that. Imagining a man carefully enough that the enemy believes he is real, then inventing the circumstances of his demise so that the larger fiction continues smoothly. There is something godlike in it, and also bleak. A private bureaucracy of existence and erasure. Little by little, the war ended. Berlin would fall, Hitler would die. The camps would be uncovered in their horror. Europe would stagger into a peace that felt less like celebration than exhausted release. The shooting stopped, but the century did not soften. The Cold War was already taking shape. New shadows were forming even as the old ones receded. Men who had learned to live by covert means were not necessarily going to be left in peace. For Garbo, that new reality brought a fresh and chilling concern. He had been one of the most successful double agents of the war. That is not a safe thing to be once peace arrives. Knowledge is dangerous after victory. Reputation can be dangerous too, especially when intelligence services multiply, archives circulate, and former enemies or new rivals may wish to locate those who embarrass them or exploit what they know. Survival after espionage often demands a second disappearance. And so, in one of the more melancholy turns of the story, Juan Pujol faded from sight. At one stage, his death was effectively staged. He vanished into obscurity, living under a different identity, spending years far from the spotlight of the history he had helped shape. There is a particular sadness in that. The man who built perhaps the most successful fictional network in wartime deception ultimately had to become, in a sense, fictional himself. The architect of ghosts joined the ranks of the obscured. Part of me finds that profoundly fitting. Part of me finds it tragic. Because the public imagination prefers clear endings. The hero is recognized. The mission is explained. The medal shines. The nation remembers. But intelligence history rarely grants such neat closure. Its victories are often compartmentalized, delayed, or misunderstood. Many who perform the most decisive, unseen work are then asked to live unseen as well. Their reward is not applause. It is often simply survival. Years passed before broader recognition began to catch up with Garbo's story. By then, the war had become memory, then history, then myth. New generations learned of the great campaigns, the towering leaders, the famous battles. But gradually, researchers and historians illuminated the hidden architecture behind some of those turning points. They traced the channels of deception. They reconstructed the plans. They rediscovered the seemingly mild Spaniard whose imagination had helped pin armies in place. And what did they find when they looked at him closely? Not a superhuman machine, not an icy genius detached from morality. They found a man of stubborn conviction, deep anti-totalitarian feeling, unusual nerve, and almost reckless inventiveness. A man who began with no formal place in the grand apparatus of war, yet forced his way into significance through sheer audacity. A man who understood, perhaps better than many professionals, that the enemy's mind could itself be turned into a battlefield. That is Garbo's true legacy. He reminds us that war is not won only by strength. It is also won by understanding how strength can be misdirected, by studying pride, expectation, bias, and fear, by recognizing that human beings, even brutal and intelligent ones, do not see reality cleanly. They see what they are prepared to see. And if that preparation can be patiently shaped, then even mighty institutions can be made to serve a lie. There is another lesson, too, a darker one. Totalitarian regimes often imagine themselves invulnerable because they command obedience and inspire terror. They believe fear will sharpen their accuracy. But fear often does the opposite. It distorts judgment. It rewards conformity. It encourages officials to prefer information that flatters prior belief or aligns with what superiors already want to hear. Garbo's success was not only a triumph of Allied ingenuity, it was also a revelation of authoritarian weakness. The Third Reich could be deceived at this scale because it was powerful, yes, but also rigid, vain, suspicious in the wrong ways, and intellectually trapped inside its own assumptions. That is worth remembering far beyond the Second World War. Whenever a state grows too certain of its own myth, whenever institutions prize ideological comfort over inconvenient truth, whenever power begins to believe its own theater, deception becomes easier. Garbo did not merely fool Germany. He exploited the structural blindness of a regime that believed itself master of destiny. And yet, for all the strategic brilliance, I keep returning to the man himself. To the human being seated at a desk, carrying the burden of invented names and real consequences. Because history can sometimes flatten such figures into cleverness. It can make them seem like puzzles solved by intelligence archives. But Pujol was not an archive. He was flesh, nerves, fatigue, conscience, memory. He breathed the same air as everyone else. He worried. He aged. He must have wondered, at least in the lonelier hours, whether the lies would one day consume the truth of who he was. Perhaps that is why his story endures so powerfully. It is not merely a tale of wartime cunning. It is a study in identity under pressure. Who are you when your greatest service to humanity requires you to speak in the voice of evil? Who are you when your victories must be hidden? Who are you when the world changes because of what you have done, and yet the world mostly goes on without knowing your name? Juan Pujol Garbo gives one answer. You are still responsible for choosing your side, even when you are overlooked, even when no one recruits you, even when the methods are dangerous and morally exhausting, even when the reward is obscurity. He chose, stubbornly and against every initial obstacle, to fight the system he believed represented barbarism. And because he chose, and kept choosing, and risked everything to make himself useful, thousands upon thousands of lives may have unfolded differently than they otherwise would have. That does not make espionage clean. It does not make deception beautiful. War stains everything it touches. But sometimes, within that stain, one can still discern courage of a very unusual kind. Not the courage to charge a gun position, not the courage to stand in plain sight. The quieter courage to remain hidden, to remain disciplined, to let others take the visible glory, while you tend the invisible flame of a lie designed to save the truth. So when you think of the liberation of Europe, think also of him. Think of the beaches, yes. Think of the soldiers and sailors and airmen who paid in terror and blood. But somewhere behind them, in a room far from the surf, sat a man with a pen and a fabricated army, persuading the enemy to wait for an attack that would never come. That is one of the strangest triumphs of the war, and one of the most human. Because in the end, Garbo's greatest weapon was not violence. It was insight into the frailty of certainty. He knew that men could be trapped not only by barbed wire and concrete, but by their own expectations. He knew that a dictator's empire, however immense, still had to interpret the world through fallible minds. and he understood that if those minds could be guided into the wrong conclusion at the right hour, then history itself might bend. It did, and long after the code messages stopped, long after the guns fell silent, long after the maps were redrawn and the war cemeteries filled with names, the lesson remained. Sometimes the fate of nations turns not on the loudest voice, but on the quietest one. Not on the man who commands divisions, but on the one who can convince divisions to remain where they are. Not on brute force alone, but on patience, nerve, and the haunting discipline of living between truth and performance. Juan Pujol Garbo lived there longer than most men could bear. That is why his story still matters. Not just as a military curiosity, not just as a dazzling intelligence success, but as a reminder that history is often shaped by the people least likely to look like history while they are making it. Our story ends here for today. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this journey into the past, please share this story, leave a like, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, history is often made in the shadows.